these two oil tycoons from Dallas bought up, which is essentially present-day all of New Orleans East, and developed these very grand visions of building what they called a city within a city. It was the city's attempt to slow down and mitigate white flight to Jefferson Parish so as to preserve the white middle class in Orleans Parish. I mean, the East itself conjures up an image. You say the East and, the East. It's a stigma. Just a place you drove through, not to. Jazzland opens, goes bankrupt in 2 years. Six Flags take it over, pumps a lot of money, opens for 1 year, pretty successful, and Katrina hits. The hot, cool place to be in the 70s turned into the crack, dangerous place in the 80s. Hey guys, real quick, before we get into it, do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. That way, you don't miss out on any of the tea. Thanks.
Hi, Charles.
Hi, Tasha.
How are you doing today?
You know what, I was thinking earlier that I'm really glad you asked me to do this podcast. I think
Really?
it's great. I think we're kind of finding our groove. So I'm great. I think this is awesome.
Likewise. Well, I'm glad that you agreed. And we're actually going to talk about a topic today that was sort of the impetus for us
You know what? You're actually right when you put it
talking
that
about
way.
a podcast and thinking about possibly doing something with a podcast. So today we are talking about New Orleans East.
New Orleans East, also known as the East.
The East, which was the subject of your dissertation for your PhD.
It was.
But before we get into that, maybe we talk a little bit about our own personal experience with
Absolutely.
the East and what we know about the East and history with the East. So I'll go
Yeah,
first,
go.
and then maybe you can tell us
Absolutely.
what inspired you to do your dissertation on the East. So I always knew the East as sort of the place that, back in like the late 80s, mid to late 80s, early 90s was really where Black people went to live. My mom is from small town just outside of Lafayette called Opelousas. When she graduated university and moved to New Orleans to work, getting an apartment in the East was like what she wanted to do. All of her girlfriends who had moved to the city were like, the East is the place to be. Like, that is the place to be. I can remember going out to the mall out there and just also as we particularly after Katrina watched the severe significant decline. It's been really unfortunate, right? Sort of the false promises I think we've been fed about revitalization in the East, right? So it was, we're going to put Jazzland that then became, Six Flags of New Orleans, and that's going to bring things to the East. We've had, we're going to build a big Walmart supercenter. We're going to build a big Target. There's been all of these promises throughout the years that we haven't seen come to fruition. It's pretty frustrating because you have an area that I feel is has all the potential for being a really great regional hub. It sits right there on I-10 as you're coming off of the Twin Spans and coming from the North Shore and Slidell. It's also in super close proximity to our neighboring cities in Mississippi. And so to have an area that I think could really be a regional center, just be so underutilized and so underappreciated is really sad and disappointing.
You're
So
hitting all the
what
right notes already.
made you want to focus on the East for your dissertation?
Great question. This has been a long intellectual journey for me that led up to this dissertation. And, I completed my PhD last year in urban studies. And this, as most things, goes back to Katrina.
Yeah.
Katrina just, understated a transformative experience. And so when Katrina hit, I was a junior at Brother Martin in Gentilly. And I started noticing, so Brother Martin flooded, not a lot, but it did, and we were all scattered, and the campus reopened in the spring semester of 2006. And before Katrina, my class had 350 students, and by the time I graduated, it was 250, so we lost 100 students. My whole senior year was very surreal in that it was just every week was a constant return of another additional student. And I started noticing these patterns of who was returning and who was not returning. And I started noticing this return was also following along racial and geographic lines. The big ones were Lakeview, St. Bernard Parish, and the East.
Mm-hmm.
And at Brother Martin, I didn't yet have the language to describe what I was noticing and the patterns I was seeing, but I always questioned why at the time the very few Black students we did have just all happened to be from either Gentilly, right around Brother Martin, or the East, specifically Eastover,
Right.
this very upscale gated community. And as a child, you know, New Orleans East, for a lot of people who didn't live East, was a place you drove through, not to.
Right.
Okay. It wasn't really until Jazzland that opened in the end of 1999, early 2000, where it became kind of a destination, if you will, for people to go to. But even that itself was an uphill battle, as we'll talk about later. So it was always just an interesting place. And you know, what really fascinated me about the East was on the surface, when you look at it, it looks no different than Jefferson Parish, which is where you and I grew up.
Right.
And I had this very clear moment when I was doing my dissertation. I spent a lot of time driving through every part of these, every subdivision, every neighborhood, every main corridor, the side, everything. And there's one day that was particularly striking, and it was a street in the Kenilworth subdivision, which is one of the older subdivisions, late 60s, early 70s. And I kid you not, and I called my parents, and I told them, if I were to blindfold y'all right now and take you to where I am, you would not be able to tell if you were in Tarrytown or New Orleans East. You would not be able to tell if we were on Legion Drive, the street I grew up, or the street in Kenilworth. And I was like, there's no one convinced that it's not the same architects and developers who built this subdivision.
Right.
So it was this idea that, you know, as an urbanist, you know, part of studying cities is studying the suburbs, because the suburbs are part of cities and this whole ecosystem. So it just really kind of started with asking these pivotal questions. So that all happens. I graduate, ended up going to Tulane, and my first college class is urban sociology. And that's where I really learned the terms segregation, gentrification. And I finally had the tool to describe things that I've noticed, but now actually have the research behind to back up what I've noticed. So that led into like a little peripheral area of research. Was I got really fascinated by dead malls, malls that die. Okay, and on the West Bank we had Belle Promenade and Marrero, Oakwood, not really, but kind of, and then Esplanade and Kenner. But in the East it was Lake Forest Plaza Mall. Right. So you know what happens when you have these malls that are built as anchors of suburbs, only for those suburbs to decline, and then this big massive space that becomes vacant, right? So, you know, I did my graduate program in Georgia, and I came back and I did another graduate program, and I wrote this paper in one of my courses on the history of Lake Forest Plaza Mall, and my professor loved it. He goes, "This is an incredible paper," and I remember him saying this, "I think you're onto something." And this is when I was finishing my courses and I took my comp exams, and you write what's called you come up with a topic for your dissertation. And my advisor said, "I think you should make this your dissertation." And I go, "Make what?" He goes, "New Orleans East." And I go, "Oh, I've never really thought about that." And the more I thought about it, I was like, you know what, you're right. Because in all of my studies, New Orleans is written about prolifically. Particularly the older neighborhoods. Everyone knows about the French Quarter and the Garden District and Treme and all of this. New Orleans East is incredibly understudied and misunderstood when it comes to the rest of the city. Yeah. Now, granted, part of that is it's the newest part of the city in terms of like the urban development of New Orleans, but it's just misunderstood. And as someone who seeks truth through knowledge, I decided that I think there needs to be an academic proper narrative of New Orleans East to counter the misnarratives that have so long characterized and stigmatized this place. Yeah. Right? So it just morphed, and then voila, I wrote this dissertation, right? And I've learned an incredibly fascinating tale that I thought I knew on the surface, but only began to scratch when I was undergoing my research. And at the end of the day, what really drives, and I continue to work on this, right? I work with a group called New Orleans East Matters, and we continue to work on this. We've been meeting with people, and you know, traction is happening, just really begrudgingly slow. And what's interesting is that the most recent developments in New Orleans East is Bayou Phoenix. So Bayou Phoenix is the former Jazzland, which became the Six Flags, which, you know, closed in August 2005, never to reopen. And let's just call it what it is. We're approaching 20 years. Yeah. Not one decade, but two decades, and New Orleans East is still in the state that it's in. Yeah. This past week alone, we're in November 2024, they just started the dismantling
Demolition, yeah.
of all of the rides. So we're 20 years removed, and we're just now starting this revitalization effort, right? So that led me to write what ended up being a 300-page dissertation, to where I delved into the history of the East. I conducted 25 interviews, archival data, census data, community meetings, and it just gave me a trove of data, right, which we're to work with. And I think over all of this time of doing my research, which has been for years, people have been curious about it and asking questions, but I felt that this podcast would be a good vehicle to which to finally tell this story to people who've been getting bits and pieces, right? And this is what brought me to this. And again, we all know the East. I mean, the East itself conjures up an image. You say the East in not even New Orleans, but this Louisiana, South, and they're like, oh, the East. The stigma, right? And that stigma is really kind of the crux of my research, okay? So yeah, that's really what brought me to that. So what do you think about the intellectual journey itself?
So it's been interesting for me as your friend going on that journey with you, because I do remember when you started with the dead malls and the discussions we would have, and as you were doing the research and pulling old news articles about Belle Promenade and Lake Forest and all of the things. And
I was sending you so many images. Look at this ad from the 70s.
I was like going back and thinking about like, oh my God, remember when we used to go to the movie theater at Belle Promenade and that kind of stuff. So it has been really interesting to see you go on that journey from one really specific area to take you to where you arrived. And I mean, just the deep research that you did on not just the history of the East, but the present and that assessment of what could potentially happen for the future. Your continued engagement in what that can look like for the future. And again, part of what inspired me to say, these are the things that we should be talking about and sharing more broadly. To your point, there is so much of a stigma and so much misinformation around New Orleans East. And so I hope that this is just one of many episodes that we get to have around that topic, because there really is so much to discuss there with regards to how we've arrived at the place that we're in, but also what are the things that are going on there to move this area of the city forward.
Absolutely.
So how about you give us a little bit of an intro to how we essentially ended up with a city within a city?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said that, right? So New Orleans East was explicitly built, and this was the phrase used, called a city within a city. And, you know, like you said, this is going to be a topic that we revisit, but I like to think of this intro episode as a very macro overview of my research, right? So I'm going to kind of synthesize a lot in a short amount of time here. You know, more or less up until the 1950s, New Orleans East was a swampland.
Yeah.
Which is the history of New Orleans, right? We've had to drain the swamp, okay? Now, what happened in New Orleans East is not in a vacuum, and this is New Orleans. The development of New Orleans East happened post-war America when suburbanization was in overdrive in America.
Yeah.
Right. This massive post-war white flight to the suburbs. Okay, and New Orleans, like every other city, wanted to capitalize on that. Now, in New Orleans, the suburb was Jefferson Parish. So in 1959, these two oil tycoons from Dallas bought up, which is essentially present-day all of New Orleans East, and developed these very grand visions of building what they called a city within a city to make it and it was very explicit at the time. It was the city's attempt to slow down and mitigate white flight to Jefferson Parish so as to preserve the white middle class in Orleans Parish by recreating a suburban environment, right? Now, think about it. New Orleans East functionally looks different from the rest of New Orleans.
Yeah.
Older New Orleans looks characteristically New Orleans, right?
Yeah.
Shotgun houses and all the architecture. You go to New Orleans East, it is quintessentially suburban.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just different from that aspect. And at first the plan worked, right? So they drained the swamp in the 60s and they built the first subdivision at the time, which is present-day Village de la East. Right. So the very far reach of the East by Michoud and Nassau. And And that was deliberate because of Michoud being right there. So
Right.
jobs and houses or whatever. When you look at the demographics in 1970, 85% of New Orleans East was white. It has flipped in the decade since. It is now 85% black. White is now currently, if I'm not mistaken, 3%.
Wow.
That's an 82% decrease in the white population.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is if the intent was to create a white middle-class suburban enclave, on the outset it did work, right, as evidenced by the 1970 census. But what was beginning changed dramatically in a very quick period of time, right? And, you talked about your mom moving there, and you are very correct. In the 70s and 80s, New Orleans East was the place to be, regardless of race. It was basically middle class. If you're middle class, you're moving to the east.
Yeah.
It was new houses, new apartment complexes
were coming out. Yep.
And, Kenilworth opened up as the first subdivision, I believe, in like 1967, and that's close to Gentilly, right? So it's just kind of a natural outgrowth from Gentilly, the Ninth Ward, to this vast expanse called New Orleans East. So we saw this huge growth between 1970 and 80, primarily of white middle-class residents moving into these new subdivisions. By the mid-70s, the cream of the crop was Lake Forest Estates.
Right.
Lake Forest Estates was an exquisite neighborhood with a golf course plant and all this green space and lakes. And then right next to Lake Forest Estates, they opened Lake Forest Plaza Mall. When Lake Forest Plaza Mall opened, it was the largest mall in the South at the time. No other mall rivaled it, and by the early 80s, it accounted for 25% of sales tax revenue in Orleans Parish. It was so successful that Lakeside Mall in Metairie was on the verge of shutting down. Wow. Think about that for a second.
Yeah.
Lakeside Mall is thriving. It could not be in a better advantageous location. It's at the intersection of Causeway and I-10. You get the North Shore, everybody.
And it's one of the few malls, not just in the state, but in the nation, that is still the traditional indoor mall.
Absolutely.
And for the most part is thriving and expanding. And, so while individual stores might be closing and you see changes there, I mean, they are like tearing stuff down to extend the footprint.
Correct.
I mean, they are one of the few malls that are kind of the exact opposite of what you are seeing happen with indoor malls. It's wild to watch.
So Lake Forest Plaza Mall opened at Reed and I-10. It more or less was successful to like the mid 80s, late 80s, right? So you started to see a lot of stores pull up by the late 80s. And this was within the context of a very rapidly changing demographics in New Orleans East. So while the East was growing in terms of white middle class between 70 and 80, New Orleans East was actually the first place in Metro New Orleans where the black middle class was moving. It was the first part in metropolitan New Orleans. Now, part of that is that Jefferson Parish was very unfriendly to having blacks move there, so they chose the East for that reason, right? Yeah. And so when I was doing my research, I situated this within a larger theoretical understanding of how the black middle class is operating in America. And that's really a lot of my research. The black middle class, after the civil rights in the 60s, where we ended housing discrimination in 1968, paved the way for the rise of the black middle class to also in search of that American dream in the suburbs. But what we found in cities across America is that when the black middle class moved in, the white middle class moved out.
Yeah.
Very quickly. And there's what we call a tipping point. So a tipping point is this idea at what rate or what is the threshold where white people feel comfortable with black people moving into their neighborhood? Is it 25%? Is it 50%? Generally speaking, when you reach 50%, whites move out in very large numbers. So this was happening. And so white middle class stays. But what ends up really speeding up the process, and this happened very clearly in New Orleans East, when the oil crash hit, everything goes back to the oil crash. A lot of the first-time homebuyers who moved to the East were working in the oil and gas industry. So when that industry collapsed, they all moved out, either because of the foreclosure rates in New Orleans East were higher than any part of the metro area. They fled to the North Shore, and that just expedited the whole process. What happened was, as they were fleeing the apartment complexes, the city started explicitly steering Section 8 vouchers, which was new at the time, to New Orleans East. So in a span of 10 years, and there was one quote that really, when I was doing my archives, that really kind of captured the essence of this. And it was a writer for the Times speaking at the time describing this transition. And he said something to the effect of the hot, cool place to be in the 70s turned into the crack, dangerous place in the 80s. And that's a very powerful language to describe this
Yeah.
transition, right? So this just
But
completely...
it's also very purposeful and intentional
Oh, yeah.
and coded
Absolutely.
dog whistle language to describe it as well.
Absolutely, right? So so the racial transition in the 80s just completely solidified by the 90s. So by 1990, New Orleans is overwhelmingly black, middle class, poor, and the apartment classes. And the apartment classes are interesting because they're on the interstate. They're very visible, right? So you can see it.
Yeah.
That is very critical to how we understand the East. A lot of my research focused on the idea that what you see from the interstate drives your narrative of New Orleans East. Right. So we get to the 90s, and the 90s was just this decade of very outspoken efforts to revitalize these. And that was really driven by a few things. Lincoln Beach, which is on the lake. What to do with Lake Forest Plaza Mall, which was on its last leg in the 90s. The proposition in the early 90s of building a theme park, Jazzland, right? And then the renovation of housing throughout the East. So these are kind of 4 things that were really critical. Also, fun fact, when New Orleans landed the Hornets from Charlotte in the late 90s, the original proposal was to build the arena in New Orleans East. I have the renderings and everything. It's fascinating history. It ended up going downtown and not the East, but that caused a lot of bitterness in the East for many reasons, right? But what I found in my research was all these efforts to revitalize panned out for various reasons, right? Jazzland opens, goes bankrupt in 2 years. Six Flags take it over, pumps a lot of money, opens for 1 year, pretty successful. Sales start falling the second year, and then Katrina hits. Right? Lincoln Beach has undergone, I'm not exaggerating, at least 10 different iterations of revival plan, only for it to fall to the wayside, right? We never figured out what to do with all of the apartment complexes. Just yesterday, council member Oliver Thomas, who represents the East, did a whole interview on the news about the Willow Apartments and how it's still collapsing. And we keep having the same debates every decade of what to do about New Orleans. And I'll share this with you. Something very interesting is New Orleans East, in terms of land mass, is the largest part of New Orleans. So it's divided by the Industrial Canal, right? And it houses, in the state of Louisiana, the highest concentration of black wealth in this state. I'm going to say that one more time. The highest concentration of black wealth in this state is in New Orleans East, but the landscape does not reflect that. Right? And that's a problem, okay? So we've created over decades these conditions that have created this environment that have allowed for a narrative to stigmatize this place that's not actually rooted in reality. When you get off of the interstate, there are beautiful subdivisions with man-made lakes that you don't see anywhere else, right? Wonderful houses, but the strip malls and the streets around them indicate otherwise, right? And what ends up happening is we have lumped all of New Orleans East as one big monolith, and that's something I say a lot in my research, and we don't do that for the rest of New Orleans, right? So what I'm saying all this, that this is not something that happened overnight. This happened over decades and has led to a fundamental misunderstanding of what this place is and how it got there. And something that really struck me earlier when we started this episode, you said something after Katrina, how it started going into decline. It was well in decline before Katrina, right? And, dating back to the 80s. So I think we're at a point now, we're at a very critical inflection point of where do we go from here? We're 20 years removed. They just started dismantling the former Jazzland. We're going to have a mayoral election next year, right? And there's going to be a lot of eyes of what are you going to do for New Orleans East? And the East and residents who live in the East, who I interviewed, they're on defense mode because they've been not lied to, but let down systematically for decades. So I think this research is important because this is a part of the city that matters. And it's only to the benefit of us to invest in New Orleans East for the benefit of all of Orleans Parish.
So what's the way forward?
Man, the way forward is first, I'm a firm believer we can't fix the problem until we first understand how we got there, which is why I did my dissertation in the first place. I wanted an accurate, academic, quantitative, and qualitative research study to counteract the misinformation that has so long stigmatized this place.
Absolutely.
Right? That it's not just a place of poverty and crime that people have thrown under the bus. That it's a place that has so much untapped potential, right? To become and fulfill the dream what it always was, to be this suburban city within a city in Orleans. And, in my research, I've met a lot of fascinating people in politics, developers, and it's interesting that we all agree that something needs to be done, but it's about who's going to take that first step.
Yeah.
Right? And I find that to be the challenge. And to kind of bring this back to Lake Forest Plaza Mall, that side of Route 910 is very symbolic of what has happened. It went from Lake Forest Plaza Mall to a Lowe's after Katrina rebuilding, and it closed, and now it's a Goodwill. That's very symbolically important.
Right.
That Goodwill was not necessarily what the community wanted, and it symbolizes that this is the best they can get.
Or necessarily what the community needs.
Correct, right? And again, when you see that driving the interstate, it just further perpetuates the idea that people already have of New Orleans East. And, you know, something I found really fascinating in my archives was looking at op-eds and how we don't want to become another New Orleans East. You hear that a lot.
Yeah.
And anytime an apartment complex was proposed in Slidell or Metairie, we don't want to become a New Orleans East. That's pretty powerful to say that, right? So again, you know, I think this is going to be a topic that we continue. I wanted to kind of set the stage first of why what brought me to this research, why I'm doing this research, why I continue to do this research. And at the end of the day, these are taxpayers who deserve to have nice amenities and who should not have to drive outside of their community to get basic things such as a grocery store, right? To get restaurants, to get eateries. There's 80,000 people out there.
Yeah, I think that's what's so important.
80,000 people out there.
Reinforce.
And 2 grocery stores. That's
the
it.
lack of just day-to-day resources, a place to easily go banking, restaurants to eat at. There is not a lack of dollars in this community.
Certainly not. There's a lot of dollars.
But there's a lack of amenities and what needs to be done to change the narrative so that we can also change the economic outlook.
Correct. And, you know, I'm with this. One tangible thing, and this kind of connects to Super Bowl prep, is the organization I work with, New Orleans East Matters, after the Super Bowl committee came out saying, we're doing these 500 infrastructure projects. We wrote an op-ed saying, okay, cool, let's make sure New Orleans East benefits from this. And we delved into what I call shaming, right? Every time I'm in a meeting, we emphasize, it's been 20 years.
Yeah.
And that it shames them.
It's
been
long
20
past
years.
our turn.
And we were like, okay, fine. You're doing all these improvements to put the city's best image forward. Well, New Orleans East is a major entryway into the city, right? So clean up that neutral ground. And you know what? They cleaned it up.
Yeah.
And it looks great. As simple as that is, it matters, right? So I think the Super Bowl, in the way that it's an impetus for addressing needs that have been neglected for so long in downtown, is equally as much an impetus to possibly start revitalizing New Orleans East. Now, granted, the interstate stuff is a short-term, immediate thing, which matters in terms of the image.
Yeah.
But I'm really hoping this paves the way, literally, for addressing I-10 and what it could be.
And what it could be. Absolutely.
Right.
Well, we'll definitely include the link to the op-ed in our show notes, and also some access to the research that you've been doing, your dissertation, so that listeners can get more of what you've been working on in the East. And as always, it's definitely going to be a topic that we continue to talk about and engage with. So thank you very much, Charles.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to continue this conversation with you.
It's going to be good.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Pelican Briefs.
If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button.
If you are loving the show, you can help us keep the conversation going by supporting us on Patreon.
Your contribution on Patreon ensures we can continue producing quality content you love.
Click the link in the description to become a patron today.
Until next time, this is Pelican Briefs.